We are going live. Yeah. So, hi everyone. This is the event, the webinar that is being organized by Ambedkar Periyar Phule Study Circle, IIT Bombay. And today's topic is the future of policing in India. And we have a digital right activist, Srinivas Kodali, with us, who will be speaking about this topic. So I invite Prerna to introduce the speaker and start the event.
Okay. Thank you, Pranav. Welcome, Srinivas. Srinivas is an interdisciplinary researcher and hacktivist documenting digitization in India. He advocates for privacy, cybersecurity, and accountability of digital infrastructure. Today, he will be talking about the future of policing in India. So, I invite Srinivas to begin his talk. Thank you.
Unmuting myself. Thank you, Prerna, for the introduction. Do you want me to wait for a few more minutes, or I can just go ahead and start the presentation?
I think we can start.
Okay. So, just sharing my presentation. Yeah. Okay. I think you can see the screen. So, as Prerna introduced, I'm a researcher who focuses on documenting digitization in India. I'm not someone who is familiar with the criminal justice system in a traditional setup, like a lawyer or an individual who has experience dealing with the criminal justice system directly. I'm an outsider to the criminal justice system that way. But I understand technology and how technology is being used to digitize and modernize policing in India. So the talk is largely going to be that, and what kind of events are leading towards modernization of policing in India. So, if you look at the role of police in any society, it is essentially to uphold rule of law, preserve public order, protect internal security, protect both public and private property, and prevent crime. Largely, you can sum up the role of police into these few categories, with most of their individual laws being framed for the police to enact their duties in these roles. Now, if you talk about failures in these aspects, it's rarely that we see that police are impartial in India. They are supposed to be impartial while they're upholding the rule of law. It's not often the case. Public order is something that they actively try to preserve by using any form of violence necessary. Now, if you talk about internal security, India has a very historic past where we had a lot of internal security troubles with respect to Naxalism, with respect to terrorism, and external actors who have also played a role. But in the recent times, if you look at the issue of failures of internal security in India, Bombay attacks would stand out. And it actually was an incident where the Indian police establishment, the Ministry of Home Affairs, which essentially deals with the internal security at large, had multiple failures in protecting public order, in protecting the state at large and individuals. What we've seen during Bombay attacks was essentially there were multiple failures of intelligence. Uh, to some extent, there are statements where they are said that the MHA or the intelligence agencies actually knew about an attack but could not prevent it. But either way, there was massive failures of intelligence. Even they could not identify these actors who are among us. Like the MHA is required, like part of its job, to identify foreigners, either with a visa or without one, who are probably in India. So it failed to identify certain foreign actors who were involved during the Bombay attacks, people who came to India who helped these attackers identify locations. So there were multiple failures, and even after the attacks were ongoing, there was not a major counter response. Police were ill equipped. The NSG couldn't arrive in time. At large, it was a major failure of policing in the modern 21st century for India. Even when the police wanted to provide a counter response, they did not have the equipment. So the Bombay attacks led to a serious consideration of modernization of policing in India. I mean, I would say this was the pivotal moment for the Indian Home Affairs Ministry to actually look at what needs to be done to improve internal security and what needs to be done about policing in India. I would say if one needs to talk about the future of policing, at least with modern policing, it has to start with Bombay attacks in India. Now, there were multiple reactions by the Indian state to these attacks. Uh, the primary action that they were trying to do is identify people. So the people, the terrorists who actually came into Bombay via the sea route, tried to disguise themselves as Indian citizens, fishermen primarily, and neither the Coast Guard, the Navy, or even the police, when these people landed, were able to differentiate some external actor coming into the Indian borders, right? They use coast as a threat vector, but primarily when you look at borders, they're always protected. You have selected channels where people can cross over, whether it's flight, boarding points, or sea at the port. It's always monitored. Now, the MHA and the internal security establishments need to know who is an individual who is coming over, who's crossing over, and how do we identify them. It's a task that they can't do when not everybody in the country has a ID card, which is why you see that right after Bombay attacks, the Ministry of Home Affairs started carrying out the national population register by distributing multipurpose national identity cards, which also coincided with other economic efforts by the Indian state of issuing Aadhaar card. There were two parallel processes, but moving ahead, they also were focused on modernizing the policing infrastructure. Since they saw coast as a threat, they started investing on coastal police stations immediately. And they networked every other police station using internet. Like primarily, they wanted information sharing between every police station on the coast. So if there was any intelligence that was coming from Kerala police, they really wanted the Bombay police and the Karnataka police to actually have access to it in real time. What if there were simultaneous attacks that were going to be carried out along the coast, and the police is required to react to it in real time? And without the information being shared in real time, it is hard to react. So one of the tasks that they did immediately was to network each police station and start digitizing every FIR. This was later extended to the rest of the country. We have about 15,000 police stations in the country, and almost nearly 14,000 some odd police stations or all network. I believe they're trying to get to 100% connectivity among police stations. Uh, and the parliament essentially increased budgets for the police to get new weaponries, new infrastructures. India essentially invested a lot of money in modernizing policing right after Bombay attacks. And this is where you see that all new forms of policing have their roots too. As I was saying, the modernization of policing started with coastal police primarily. Mostly coastal police got access to new equipment. They were also doing this process of registration of boats. Not all boats were registered. Like if you're a fisherman, you have a boat. We don't know if your boat is an Indian boat or a Sri Lankan boat or it's an external boat. So they were enrolling fishermen in Bombay. There was this project called biometric identification cards for fishermen. It was introduced along with NPR. Then there was registration of fishing boats, and essentially you were trying to increase surveillance and intelligence within the course. So there was a lot of money which was allocated to do these exercises. And when we're talking about modernization, right, it did not happen uniformly across the country. It's unevenly distributed because we saw an external attack on Bombay. There was increased, uh, I would say, policing around the West Coast. And also at the same time, borders primarily across the country, but compared to the internal heartland. But when we're talking about giving away grants by the allocations by the parliament, it's often political in nature, right? So people in power at the center and the state can always negotiate to get some of these funds allocated to their state. So all of this modernization in India is uneven because of these political, economic, and other social actors at play. There were few projects that the Indian state started carrying out right after the attacks. As I was saying, they were networking all of these police stations. They have this project called CCTNS, Crime and Criminal Tracking Networks and Systems, which essentially are computer networks. You have large scale databases, criminal databases, and they started digitizing all of their old fingerprint records. The MHA has a 200-year-old history of storing fingerprints. So they started digitizing every fingerprint in every other police station and fingerprint record bureaus. And you see them digitizing FIRs, and any new evidence was essentially networked. Like they were storing it in computer databases and they were all networked. So anyone in Bombay can essentially look at FIRs from Delhi or Hyderabad across the country. So every police can identify if they have a criminal that they caught. They can essentially find out all of his past criminal records and past FIRs across the country. So this digitization has introduced new forms of policing, and they were experiments on how to do this. It was, as I say, it was not at once that these technologies and practices were induced across the country. We saw some of these technology and methods distributed by the MHA among various state police departments. So you would see, for example, Hyderabad and Telangana police was using facial recognition system, while Andhra Pradesh police was using iris. So while there was this idea of digitization that was happening to share information, to increase surveillance, there were also these new policing practices. Uh, right after Bombay attacks, the MHA essentially gave away an alert to all police stations across the country, fearing there could be more such similar attacks, and they should essentially start improving security along the coast. And there were news reports of under police going door to door searching identity cards of people who were whom they thought were potentially Bangladeshis who came to Vizag from Bangladesh. So what we saw is like police suddenly waking up and saying, you know what, there could be people already in India who will probably attack us, or there are people who are hiding. So we need to go and identify these people. So they were essentially going door to door and asking them to produce their papers. But not everybody had papers. And this is where you also see the need and push by the MHA to identify the entire population. Now, these practices of door to door searches are colonial, and some of them are military practices, like if cordon and search in particular, where you cordon off the entire neighborhood, and there are at least half a battalion, like 200 cops, who are going into the neighborhood and trying to verify everyone in that neighborhood. Most militaries use this practice to identify insurgents in war-torn areas. You're trying to identify weapons, if there are any people living in houses in the war. The Indian Army employs it in Kashmir to identify terrorists. For a large period of time, these cordon and searches were not active even in Kashmir until 2018. I think they were recently brought back. These searches were evolved as a practice in Hyderabad around 2013 in civilian neighborhoods, primarily to identify who's living, right? Like you have these people who are living in different neighborhoods, and the police is essentially going to them and asking them to produce papers, like whoever they are. They could be migrants from within the country, and they could be outsiders as well. So this, as a practice, kind of evolved in India. So there are some tweets by different police departments. This is a station house officer in Hyderabad who essentially tweeted out that on 26th October 2018, they have conducted a cordon search in Mangalhat as per the instructions of the DCP of West Zone Hyderabad. And you have a similar search that the Amritsar Police Commissionerate is essentially carrying out around Trillium Mall in Amritsar. So what you're witnessing here is that new forms of policing practices where the police are going door to door into neighborhoods and asking people to identify themselves. The reason I'm saying it's new is it's not that the Indian police wasn't doing this in the past, but we see increased activity of this happening, and which is very coordinated as well. Like there are these practices of nakabandi which they used to carry out during elections, during um any kind of particular incident, right? Like if you're at riots, you just seize off that area, and anybody who's going in or coming out, you would essentially ask for papers. But now this is happening without cause. There is no tensions, there are no riots, there is no security threat, but you see that the police are continuously searching for something unknown. Like they don't know what they're searching for. They call it cordon and search, but they don't tell you what they're searching for. So part of these coordinate searches, they are also going and identifying the population, right? So there are all these new practices apart from coordinate searches to stop people on the road and take their fingerprints, take their photos to essentially identify if someone is a criminal, if someone is escaping from a prison, if someone is absconding from a court hearing. So the only way for, or it could be a murderer who left his fingerprints, and the police is essentially searching for these kind of people. And if they stop you and they collect your fingerprint, and if your fingerprint matches with any of these conditions, they would essentially detain you and take you to the police station and start the investigation process to further identify who you are and what all crimes you probably have committed. So this again is a new practice where a part of CCTNS, they have this system called AFI, sorry, Automatic Fingerprint Identification System. They call it AFIS. We also have facial recognition component of it, which is Automatic Facial Recognition System, AFRS. A lot of these experiments of stopping people on the road and trying to identify them essentially happened in Hyderabad, uh, and they were distributed. So on the right, you see the Hyderabad police constable stopping someone and taking his photograph to identify he's if he's a wanted person. On the left, uh, there is a uh, car that you see here, police van with an iris machine, and the police are queuing up all the people in a neighborhood where they are conducting cordon and search, where each of these individual has to come along with their ID card and also submit their iris to the cops to see if they are some ex-criminals. So what the AP police did, uh, also the Telangana police, both Andhra Pradesh and Telangana police did, was they started increasing surveillance on criminals, on ex-criminals. So the way they did that is to create criminal profiles of these people by doing a large survey. When you're doing a cordon search, right? Like you're identifying people who are living in certain neighborhoods. So they also did a criminal survey where they collected all the iris of ex-criminal. This is something that the Andhra Pradesh police did. While in case of Telangana, they geotagged and collected photographs of every ex-criminal. So you know where these people are. So what you then do is you increase surveillance on them. You ask your beat policing officials to go to a particular location that's being shared to them over an app to see if this individual is at home. So all of this was done using new tools, new technologies, which were interconnected to these criminal networks and databases. So what you essentially are witnessing is that criminal profiling has now become a practice where the police maintains a criminal profile and then essentially goes and looks out for people if they are an ex-criminal. And if you are an ex-criminal, then there is increased surveillance on you. You could be a criminal from Uttar Pradesh who's coming to Hyderabad for a living wage, but the Hyderabad police don't know that you have a criminal history from Uttar Pradesh. So the moment they identify you, they start increasing surveillance on you in Hyderabad. Yeah, so some more photos of these practices. This is by a Delhi police official who's stopping someone who looks like a suspect and using facial recognition to identify who he is. Uh, Same thing with a, a station house officer in Hyderabad, where they're trying to check suspects near an auto stand using facial recognition, fingerprint, and what they call third eye, which is all the vehicle registration data, all your personal registration data like Aadhaar, um, phone numbers. So any other database that the MHA has access to, they can search through based on any identity card that you give, whether you give a driver's license, a voter ID, a phone number, or your Aadhaar number. They can just search through these databases and see if you are identifying as the right individual or not. So the model or the form of this form of policing that they call is 360-degree criminal profiling or 360-degree policing at large. Policing in India is very colonial. We had these cheaters that, like, if you are a criminal who continuously perform crimes where you have a criminal history, the police open a sheet on you. It could be a history sheet. If you're a rowdy, they open a rowdy sheet, and they had method offenders. So there are a category of offenders and criminals in the past where the police has been traditionally keeping records of these people who are known offenders or known continuous offenders, and you essentially try to monitor them. Now, all of this is digitizing, right? Now, when they are digitizing this, it's just not your profile that they are digitizing. They're also going and collecting information about all of your known associates, including your family. So, if someone in your network has a history sheet, you are also part of the policing databases because he happens to be someone you know. Could be a relative, could be your neighbor whom you hung out with in the past. So everyone in that network is also under surveillance. As I said, they have been geotagging where these history sheeters, rowdy sheeters, and offenders at large have been living using surveys. And you then start in, there is also both targeted surveillance and automated surveillance. Automated surveillance because now you're part of their systems. All of your CCTV cameras, all of your existing surveillance infrastructure can identify you the moment you are in a new region. You could be a criminal who are from a particular state, particular village, but the moment you have arrive in a new city, they can act you're under surveillance because some of these automated systems have picked up an unusual activity that you have traveled to the city. Often, a lot of this form of policing leads to harassment. This is what we have been witnessing in Hyderabad, where a lot of this is practiced. So the Hyderabad police have an app where they are asked by an automated system to go visit some of these existing history sheeters and Audi sheeters randomly using an algorithm where they are required to go and visit this guy, take his photograph, check if he's actually at his house, mark attendance for this guy in the app. Essentially, the police are going in the midnight, usually in the night, to see if these individuals are at their house because these are known ex-criminals, and if they are not at their house in the night, that essentially means or could imply that they are out performing a crime. That's the assumption that the Indian police has. So all of this is leading to a lot of harassment, and there have been multiple ex-offenders and criminals who approached courts saying there is a lot of harassment and that they are invading their fundamental right to privacy by checking on them at midnights at unusual hours. And the courts in Hyderabad actually agreed with them and asked the police to stop their activities. But the police only limited it to these particular individuals who have approached courts. Now, as I said, they are building these 360 degrees and profiles of every individual. There is an information model in computer science called single source of truth. So if you have a bank server, say you're banking with a state bank, and the state bank has multiple branches, multiple accounts, multiple kinds of accounts, and money is distributed. You're withdrawing money at different parts of the country. So if there is any irregularity in their databases, it could harm you economically, right? So, similarly, in terms of policing databases, there is information that's being shared across multiple police departments and stations across the country of probably of one individuals or similar individuals who are part of a network. If that information is in silos, the police does not know who this individual is. So what they are trying to do is create a master database of everyone, every criminal, by potentially also creating a criminal ID. So every criminal gets an ID, and then all of his personal information is stored and in a master database. And there could be replicas of these master database. Like the MHA maintains the main database of all the criminals, and each state department can have a copy of it or can have access to this master database. So that's the idea of single source of truth here. But the problem with this is when you are digitizing FIRs, old FIRs, there could be errors, there could be false information, there could be biases. Polices are not known to have, it's not that polices in India are not known to have biases, right? We have seen different forms of biases, including biases towards religious minorities, caste-based minorities, or to outsiders in that state, right? Like every marginalized person has seen this side of the police where FIRs have been registered on them baselessly, without charges, without the need for it. But all of this is now being digitized, which essentially means that there are more FIRs and more criminal records of a particular class of people, particular category of people, particular religious or caste-based people, mostly minorities. And if that information is false or manufactured, you're still being affected by it, which is why this idea of a single source of truth based on historic practices and historic records is often problematic. So, as I said, there is this system called the CCTNS, which is a network of all policing databases, which was kind of the first phase of the project. Now we are building what is called ICJS, the Interoperable Criminal Justice System, where you're digitizing not just policing, but you're digitizing courts, you're digitizing prisons, you're digitizing forensics, you're digitizing pretty much every aspect of the criminal justice system, where all of these databases and servers are networked, and everybody inside the criminal justice system has access to all of these records, all of these criminal profiles. They have analytics over evidence. If there is certain kind of crime that is recurringly occurring at a particular neighborhood, then some of these analytics will help them identify that there is an increase in crime. And there is also exchange of information. Um, some of this could be good, like the idea that we are being presented with this is that if we digitize all of our criminal justice system records, we could essentially know if there are people in our criminal justice system who are in prisons for a very long time without their cases being heard. We could essentially act on all of these kind of prisoners. We could also ensure that through technology, the number of cases that are being heard, the number of cases, judgments that are being passed increases. Technology tends to give a certain kind of velocity to any action. But there are also challenges that come out of this system because you're intending to digitize the entire system. Uh, your traditional biases of the system tend to be digitized as well, and amplified. It's just not velocity that's being given to uh, the traditional court processes, but also the traditional practices where which hurt people, right? Like if there are more number of cases that can be filed on a particular community, that is also problematic. So it's just not the good things, even the bad parts of the setup gets amplified. And that's where the concerns come from, saying if we are giving more power to Indian police without the right set of accountability practices, where they are stopping people on the road, aimlessly searching for things without warrants, this is all problematic, right? Like all of these practices were carried out way before the new law that has been recently passed, the Criminal Procedure Identification Act, which essentially gives the Indian police the power to do these kind of searches, but they can only do this after issuing a warrant, and there are no warrants. Even with cordon searches, we don't see any warrants that the police produce to the individuals. You're just asked to do as the police requires you to do. And yeah, so and the issue with this idea of a digitized criminal justice system is that the people who are recommending it. There is a section of, I would say, lawyers, think tanks outside the policing setup, but part of a judicial setup, which is promoting this idea of ICJS. But this brings in the question of where will all the data be? Uh, in the current setup, all of this data goes to the MHA, to the police department, which essentially means even courts data, prisons data is being kept in the MHA, and
I think there is a glitch and there's a connectivity issue. We will just set it up and be back. We are really sorry for this glitch. There has been an interruption in the connection. The speaker will join back.
Hi.
Hi,
Uh,
hi.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry. Something
that's
happened and I just got disconnected.
yeah, that's
Uh,
fine.
so to start back, I'm just going to start sharing my screen. Give me a second. Yeah. So as I was saying, digitization need not mean that it's actually improving things if it's not done the right way. It could actually,
Srinivas,
yeah.
the screen is not visible. It's just a black screen that we are seeing. The slide is not visible.
Okay. Just gonna reshare. Okay. Hopefully now. Yeah. So yeah. So digitization need not mean that whatever is happening is going to improve things in a certain way. It essentially could go a different direction where it could create an authoritarian setup, and we are essentially witnessing that when we see uh, all of these new forms of technologies from facial recognition, fingerprint recognition, being used by the police to target people, to stop them middle of the street, to essentially create criminal profiles. And all of this is a violation of your direct fundamental right to privacy. Uh, the new law that we have, the rules haven't yet been framed, and even then, a lot of this setup is not okay, especially with the current way. So, when we talk about policing, it's a form of violence. We have to accept that, and the state has a monopoly over this violence. Now, if we look at the history of Indian policing, we have seen that colonial forms of policing have categorized a section of population as criminals. Like there are all these criminal tribes which have been notified during the British era, whom who were essentially said that these caste groups are essentially criminals. If you belong to this caste group, you just happen to be a criminal. You are labeled that, and you are essentially tracked throughout the country. Now we are witnessing a similar form of policing, I would say, where the police are stopping people and subjecting them to a certain form of new practices of policing, which could be ex criminals or it could be just poor people, migrants who are in a city. And all these cordon searches and stop and searches practices, you would see that often the people whom the police stop are people on the street, people who look poor. Uh, they haven't done these practices in affluent neighborhoods. You won't see cordon and searches being carried out in uh, like villas where people rich live, right? Like, I mean, the police say that they are using their uh, data, they're using all of the big data that they have collected to essentially help them decide where they need to do these coordinate searches. But all of these existing historical data is also biased, because we know that policing against the poor, against the marginalized, has always been high, and it's not free of these biases. And if when we're talking about futures, when you're talking about what kind of policing that will exist in the rest of the country, you have to look at the past and the present. And my present reality in Hyderabad and Andhra Pradesh is that all of these new practices that have emerged because of Bombay attacks are are uh, are outright illegal, unconstitutional. I don't have any other words to describe them. The police think that it's a great practice that they have imported from other countries, new technologies that they have taken from UK and US, from the New York Police Department or the London Metropolitan Departments. They're actually happy doing this because they are unaware of the fact that whatever they are doing is unconstitutional, illegal, because most of these people who are being subjected to these practices do not have the power to actually question the state. The very few people who attempted to do it, uh, our courts haven't been of any help. Uh, these practices, as I say, have started in certain parts of the country, are now being implemented across the country. Coordinate searches have been implemented in Delhi, in Punjab, in Andhra Pradesh, in Telangana. We may see this happen across different other states as well in future. Uh, with the passage of the Criminal Procedure Identification Act, every other state police department is now saying they are going to acquire new biometric fingerprint readers, acquire new mobile phones with facial recognition setup, get police departments new apps so that they can use these new practices on people. We don't know how much the resistance for this will be, but these practices have come and they are likely to be part of our everyday life. Now, coming back to the idea of legality, whether all of this is legal, whether the police can do this, the new Criminal Procedure Identification Act legally does give the police some power to identify criminals, right? But the idea here is that if you are a passerby on the street and you just look like a suspect to them, they can always stop you and subject you to these searches. However demeaning they could be, however bad they could be, you will be forced to give away your fingerprints. You will be forced uh, to give away your facial biometrics for the police to essentially identify if you are in their databases or not. Is this Does this law, if you compare this law to the right to privacy judgment, will it fare? Does it fit the proportionality test which the Supreme Court has laid down in the nine bench right to privacy judgment? I don't think it will suffice. Also, the Criminal Procedure Identification Act essentially replaced the older Identification of Prisoners Act. Uh, the law is very broad. It can allow the police department to include new forms of data collection practices, including DNA. Tested, it's a fairly new act.
Live streaming is on.
Tested, it's a fairly new act.
Live streaming is on.
Yeah, so the new law needs to be tested with the judgment. The rules haven't been yet framed. Most commenters would say it's still an overarching law. But when it comes to facial recognition and CCTV cameras and other forms of technology, most states have these public safety acts that they use to push these practices. Like Telangana has a Public Safety Act of 2013, which is what they use to push cameras across the city. The Telegraph Act of 1885 is often used for telecom interception. This is important because what's happening in Hyderabad is whenever there is a crime, whenever the police gets a 100 call, an emergency call, they go to the location, the house. The immediate thing that they do is search for nearby CCTV cameras, search and gather call data records from the nearby telephone towers during the time of crime. So if you happen to be in a particular location when a crime occurred, you are now a suspect. So there are all these new practices that we are not being told, but the police is evolving. You won't find manuals for any of this. Traditionally, policing in India has been manual based. There is each state police has a police manual. The police are expected to follow the manuals. You traditionally follow CRPC or IPC. But for all of these technological advancements that are happening, there are no rules. The police can do what they want. It's pretty much a wild, wild west here. Like we have seen instances in Hyderabad where the police have stopped people, asked them to unlock their phones under the IT Act, to search their WhatsApp chats if they have any messages that indicate they are a narcotics consumer, right? So all of this is like a direct invasion of people's fundamental right to privacy. But more than that, the argument I would actually make, I'll just end the screen presentation. So more than that, the argument that I would make is it's against dignity of people, like you being stopped on the street randomly and being subjected to all of this without cause. And now imagine this happening to an entire neighborhood, right? Like when you're doing cordon searches, it's not limited to one individual, but an entire section of the population. So this is the problematic part of these practices. It doesn't just categorize an individual as a criminal, it categorizes an entire section of people as criminals, as potential criminals who need to be watched. It's the otherization of people in our society, and it's mostly going to affect marginalized in different ways that we can't really imagine yet. Within Hyderabad, the Muslim population has been subjected to a lot of these experimentation. I call it experimentation because a lot of these practices were evolved here without any laws, and it was tested. The local population did oppose some of these practices. Then they started just changing names. For example, coordinate search is not called coordinate search anymore. It's called a community connect exercise, where the police is reaching out to the community to understand their problems and do community policing. So we see all forms of excuses being given to us to defend all these new policing practices. But the primary intent of all of these practices is to essentially evolve and identify populations, who they are, where are they coming from, and essentially monitor them round the clock and everyone. So I'll just stop here and I can take questions. I can probably answer more details of individual cases and practices. Prerna,
Prerna,
you're still
yeah.
muted. Yeah, you're muted. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Srinivas. Uh, I'll just go over some things, and then maybe we can take questions. Um, you started with how uh, policing. You started at the juncture where uh, modernization of policing began, and you spoke of how the Bombay attacks as a moment in history and in its history uh, uh, of policing as that one point uh, where there's a shift in policing, um, and you spoke of immediate um, measures taken by the state to kind of uh, make their policing more intensive. I'm just at this point I'm just wondering if it happened it so happens with uh, in so many instances where the state is supposed to protect its or like uh, make the public safe, but in this instance when it ended up surveilling its public more, it ended up making uh, measures such that it made instead of making them safe or making them feel safe, it ended up making them surveilling them more. So that is what I was thinking about. Yes, then you also talked about how this moment led to an intensive door-to-door search or racial profiling in terms of police searches, and there was a time where this was a time also when the need for IDing the entire population came around, and I think you mentioned NPR in that relation, right? And then you spoke of certain uh, features of modern uh, policing, such as criminal profiling 360-degree, and how it slowly moved to digital policing. For example, criminal profiling. You also took Hyderabad police as that one instance where the digitization of policing starts, and Hyderabad police as an instance of the same. Um, right. Uh, you also spoke of how technology, when you were speaking of the interoperable criminal justice system, also spoke of how in that instance, technology kind of gave velocity to the justice system, but it also kind of gave velocity to the biases that the criminal justice system already had in the first place. Uh, right. So some of the things I've been wondering about was, like you said, it intensified the biases, and I'm also thinking that this technology, if it was made uh, what it is, what the purpose of using technology was. in the sense that it aided the criminal justice system, but it didn't really aid the marginalized became more marginalized in that sense. Um, another thing in relation to that is if we in so many the Telangana Public Safety Act, I think you mentioned the Public Safety Act. Who is the public? I mean, they have a certain idea of the public, that the public is a certain this thing, and that they can uh, carry on surveillance on the rest of the public to keep a certain set of the public safe, in quote unquote. And I'm also thinking about if surveillance and policing is kind of synonymous with modernity in these days, because you see so many uh, housing societies and come up, and I think one of the features which they show off and as a plus thing is, oh, we have CCTV uh, fully surveilled uh, property, and yeah, they boast of it. So yeah, these are some of the things I was thinking about. Maybe you can comment on those, and then we can go ahead with the question.
I mean, you're largely right? I mean, it's just not modernization of policing; it's modernization of Indian society. When we're talking about, I only spoke about a tiny aspect of this modernization, right, in terms of policing. But when you look at the Indian society at large now, uh, when we look at Aadhaar, which as an identity project came because of Bombay attacks, uh, or pushed because of Bombay attacks. I won't say the roots are entirely Bombay attacks, uh, but which became a foundation for digital India, where you're digitizing all aspects of our society, and your identity became the foundation for it, right? So, because now you're designing a society based on identity, you do not have privacy. The foundations of digital India lie on identity. That takes away your privacy. And all of this digitization, right? Like any database where you give your ID card, then eventually ends up with the police department. Okay, this idea of 360-degree profiling is that where you're interconnecting all of these databases, is that police have access to everything and anything. And in terms of modernity, in terms of surveilling the self, right? It's just not the police surveilling us. We are doing it easier for the police by installing these cameras on ourselves for a sense of safety and security. Uh, but the problem is that when you talk about evidence, right? Like there has been a crime. When there is a crime, the police have the authority to gather evidence. And all of this happens under the Evidence Act. Now, what we are witnessing with CCTV cameras is there is no crime. Okay, there hasn't been no crime, but yet you're collecting evidence. You're collecting so much of this evidence for a future where you're saying, you know what, we're increasing surveillance to ensure there is no crime. All these cordon searches, all of the stop and searches are to identify people and criminals so that crime rate goes down. Uh, in theory, it can, okay, but the effects of it, like I didn't address that. There are no protests in Hyderabad. Okay, you can't protest in Hyderabad. So people who try to come to protest in Hyderabad from the nearby villages are pre-detained in those villages. Okay, like it's a coordinated activity done by the Telangana police where if there is a call for any kind of protest by different groups, political and non-political groups, if people who lost jobs want to protest, okay, they're stopping them. And this is not entirely because uh, the government wants control, but also there is a uh, interest from protection of property. Okay, like if there are protests, there is issues like damage to public property, damage to private property, and also any kind of lack of public order could essentially mean uh, lack of investments into that city. And this is a model that we have imported from Singapore. You can't protest in Singapore either. And when we keep talking about Hyderabad as a city, back in the 90s, we said we want to become Singapore. Singapore is a future that we set to become, and we essentially modeled all of our infrastructure to become that city state. So, and this idea also pushes you towards a single state setup where you have police have all the control, no protests, increased surveillance. Look at Singapore when you talk about surveillance. It's that I would say that we are going towards, and Hyderabad tends to be shown as a model within the country. When you look at the world, everybody shows Singapore as the next model. And when we keep talking about futures, and it's unevenly distributed. It's here. It's just not where you are probably right. Like different parts of the world have different models, and there are few models that people imported from, and Hyderabad imported all of this from different parts of the world: New York, UK, Singapore, Estonia, and from Hyderabad, different parts, different state departments are taking it over. So,
Hyderabad. So Telangana is a very young state, and it's not surprising that the state, I mean, has uh, has a rate like a stellar policing department. They have, uh, I think they've massive infrastructure, massive forces, and I think, sorry, yeah. So when I was thinking about modernity and having being synonymous with police state, it's also Telangana that I have in mind. It's not surprising that they went for having a stellar police department. Yeah, right. Okay. Uh,
I
that,
mean, in terms of the modernization projects in India, I would say Hyderabad is one of those advanced stages
hmm,
because of our history with post-liberalization periods. Andhra Pradesh at large back then worked with the World Bank, engaged with the World Bank to have a certain kind of capitalist effects to import anything new, right? We created an IT economy, which is also equally responsible for all of this technology practices that are being experimented in the state as well, because we're producing them. We're making facial recognition, we're using blockchain. So it essentially helps both ways. Like the police also become a test case for some of these companies to implement new technologies. Now our IT companies can also implement this for other uh, police departments in the country. They all become their clients.
hmm,
So it's political. There is an economic component. There's also a social component. Uh, yeah.
okay, right. Thank you, Srinivas. Uh,
Okay. Yeah.
Prakash,
So,
please go ahead.
so we have questions from the YouTube. So Tamilmani is asking, the increasing digitization and surveillance just support the already existing structural biases in society used by them for their own advantages. What is the way forward then? Can technology remove that biases?
See, so there is this argument that people always make that technology is just a tool. People can use it in different ways, right? Which is partly true, but there is also this famous paper that I would recommend that we should read, uh, where like can a certain form of technology have its own politics, right? Like think of facial recognition. It's surveillance by nature. That like take nuclear technology. Uh, it has the power to create a bomb. It has the power to generate energy as well. There are multiple and dual usages of technologies, and you always try to control a certain side of it. We are not seeing regulation of technology, right? When we talk about surveillance, when we talk about policing at large, because of this threat of national security is used, the MHA, the national security establishment, always says, you know what, you should not think of regulating us, right? Like we have so many of these misuses of surveillance, like with Pegasus. Nothing happened. The Supreme Court tried to constitute a committee. It didn't even deliver a judgment. Uh, Surveillance at large in this country is unregulated. The new data protection bill or the privacy bill or whatever the new bill is going to they're going to call it will not regulate surveillance, right? So, and national security is often used as an argument to not regulate, and that's a huge problem. While we can demand new laws, laws entirely will not solve this. I mean, we know that we have enough laws, nobody is implementing it. And think of policing implementing laws on themselves, it's not going to happen. So in general at technology, apart from policing, more people need to be represented when these systems are being designed. And that has been the core issue with Aadhaar and the whole fight around it, which led to the whole right to privacy judgment, right? Like, you know what, you are designing things without laws, you're forcing it on the population. We don't know why you're doing it. You keep telling us this is to find out fraud, remove fraud, but you never talk about all of the surveillance projects that Aadhaar also supports. And there was no regulations, right? So laws can help, but won't solve the issue. You need changes in technology, as I said to Prerna, right? Like you're building a society on identity. You can't have privacy when you build your entire foundations are identity. You need anonymity, and we don't have the space to be anonymous in this country anymore. Wherever you go, you are required to identify yourself, and that essentially keeps powering this surveillance infrastructure.
Yeah, so even in cases when we try to, like, most of the people are unaware of this idea of, like, let us say, like, how the big data, like even using apps like WhatsApp or social media uh, applications. People don't understand at some point, like, why, like, it is just the things that we post or like what we search that they are collecting, like how can it be used against them. So like, how do we make the society like much more literate in terms of digital privacy and why it is important, and what can the data that they are that is actually extracted from them, or how might be used against them, and what is the actual problem with the idea of surveillance itself?
See, uh, this is a very global problem. At the age that we are in, they're calling it the age of surveillance capitalism, right? And we are in this fourth industrial revolution that, I mean, I believe all of your companies at IITs would be saying that when they try to recruit you, everybody is probably talking about this. Now, it's a structural problem that society has, and uh, each of the societies, every country needs to deal with this. Now, are there solutions? I think what we need to understand is it's not entirely something that uh, like there are several thinkers who have been talking about how do we stop surveillance capitalism at large, right? And the reason I'm bringing surveillance capitalism right now is because it's just not the state. Like even when you talk about modern societies like the US, even if where they claim to be democratic enough, you still have private actors carrying it. And this setup requires you to be ignorant, right? They really don't want you to know how you are being turned into consumers, how you are being continued to, uh, how media is continuing to affect you, how ads are continuing to affect you, how you are being turned into uh, control the subjects. The reason I'm saying subjects is, I don't think we are in a democracy anymore. Like, the laws don't pretty much apply. So you're being controlled, you're being brainwashed, and algorithms play a role, uh, especially with media, with how Facebook and Twitter are being used to control narratives, right? So it's really hard to educate people about this. Uh, it's challenging, especially with digital literacy, when you have an entire army of private companies and political parties using it for their own gains, right? So it is challenging, but there is no other way other than educating people, organizing them, and agitating, right? So it has to happen, and whatever happened with Aadhaar, it took us what 7 years since 2010 to get at least a fundamental right to privacy. Now the problem that we have is the state doesn't want to enforce it, right? Like we have a right; it's a fundamental right. Now it will take the same amount of agitation that happened during Aadhaar to force the state to do what it's supposed to do. Uh, but it's a challenge in itself. I really don't have an answer for it apart from educating more people. Not everybody will agree with us, which is fine, but it's still a fundamental right. So we need to do it. So
So coming back to our campus in IIT Bombay, when we are actually admitting as a new student, we have to give our biometric, like fingerprint, for our identity card. So their response or reason is that, like, because the attendance is biometric, so we need to collect your data for it. And so when an RTA was filed to ask, like, is this mandatory? Has that information been communicated? So the RTA says that it is not mandatory, but that will never be communicated to the students. And like, what was the reason for, like, which was the meeting that decided this particular thing to be implemented? Is it only for students? So it is only for students and workers. The staff and the professors, they don't fall into this particular thing. And recently, when the COVID pandemic started, and during the lockdown, they started collecting the data of when a student is entering and going out of IIT. Like, they have started scanning the ID cards. So after the pandemic got over, the faculty scanning stopped. Students are still supposed to, like, show their ID card, and they're recording the whenever we are going out and coming in. So in some sense, they are like kind of normalizing surveillance. So and since, like, it is just an issue of like going out and coming in, like, it is also harder to convince students of why there's an issue in it. So, like, can you just explain, like, why the biometric information, like just giving people without any accountability and responsibility of like securing it, how is that a problem?
okay, so there is a quote that a friend used recently. I'm not going to name him. So, like all of this has now become part of a culture, right? Like Aadhaar, you ask someone asks, you give it. There's not much opposition for it. As someone who's been opposing it, I'll accept that the opposition has died down. But it's become part of a culture. Now, it doesn't mean if it's part of a culture, it's right? Like caste is part of our culture and it's not right? We continue to oppose it. Now, how is that something that has been normalized? A society tends to normalize certain things, they tend to accept it. Uh, doesn't mean that we should not oppose it. It's not right? So, in this case, where like take phones, take all these restaurants that keep demanding your numbers, or take apps that keep demanding you to enroll, right? Like the production of a certain kind of software, how do you produce this software, is affecting people to use or be subjected or be get used to this, right? Like if you're using a smartphone, you can't expect to have privacy. But there is an entire section of software developers who are trying to produce alternatives. We are using one right now, right? We don't want to use some proprietary tool. So we're using an alternate software to ensure that we don't lose our rights in some ways, right? So at large with tech, I would say it's that how what kind of production of technology is taking place and who decides to produce this technology is affecting societies. And with Aadhaar, with the entire of digital India, it's that, right? Like somebody else who is deciding that identity will be foundation of our digital society without any sort of consensus, without any sort of frameworks, without any sort of rules. It's just decided, right? Now, can there be alternatives? Of course, but we are not being given a choice. I think as long as you continue to do it, I mean, you said IIT Bombay doesn't allow you to do attendance apart from biometrics. I think you should formally file a complaint and saying, you know what, we can do a digital attendance system which is not based on biometrics, which could be based on smart cards. Every IIT student could have an ID card which he could swipe, but then their claim is, you know what, your friend could take your ID card and swipe it instead of you. So, but it's not, biometrics are not so foolproof as well, right? People also clone their fingerprints and use it. Like it's not stopping it, right? But there can always be alternatives, alternate forms of technology. And as long as people don't produce that, people don't force these people to accept it, it won't happen. If you take the Aadhaar case, they said this is the only way. We started showing a lot of privacy issues with Aadhaar. Then they started bringing masking Aadhaar, right? They started masking Aadhaar number, saying that you can't display the Aadhaar number. That happened because people opposed. We could not stop it entirely. I mean, we went to the court. The court said, you know what, Aadhaar is not mandatory for everything. It's only mandatory for subsidies. Even that is a huge problematic judgment because now you're saying there's a class of people in this country who are forced to give Aadhaar. But there is also another class of people who can live without Aadhaar, right? So we still don't accept that judgment the way the court said, oh, it's only for subsidies. But either way, it is because people are fighting back. We are winning, like smaller wins here and there, but it's a continued effort. And only when a lot of people realize why this is problematic, we will see a certain kind of counter cultures that emerge which are opposing your popular culture of accepting these things. And as long as that doesn't happen, it will remain a problem in our society.
So another thing that has been asked is like, what are the alternatives currently available? For example, with respect to like social media, like everyone thinks only like WhatsApp, but when one instance that I remember is when WhatsApp introduced the new privacy policy, a lot of people moved to Signal. So which was a huge like because WhatsApp thought that they could nicely slide that law, and everyone is so used to WhatsApp that they won't switch. But still a lot of people switched to a new platform, which actually the only thing that Signal promised was privacy in some sense. And so are there other alternatives, or what are the other alternatives that we can actually use so that more users, if they flock to it, will develop that community in a much better way?
See, before I answer the question, I want to bring one more incident. Remember that whole Twitter incident where Twitter wasn't accepting caste as a uh, part of uh, like they weren't looking at caste
Discrimination policy.
as a
Yeah.
discrimination policy, right? Caste part of uh, their Twitter terms and conditions and policies. Now, when Jack came to India, and there were a whole lot of incidents when Twitter was also deactivating a couple of Dalit journalists and researchers. There was this incident with Vikram Hegde, who's been kicked out. So there was a lot of solidarity between Dalit rights activists, and a lot of popular people who were like saying, you know what, we will exit Twitter, move on to Mastodon. It did happen for a while, quite a bit. I was part of that whole time when people were shifting, trying to figure out how to use new tools, how to communicate. But that wasn't enough. It did bring caste into Twitter's discrimination policy, but it wasn't enough for a lot of people to move away from Twitter, right? Like they had to come back because uh, what we call network effects weren't enough to actually create this ideal alternative. Now, even if we have an ideal software for something, it could be really hard to change people, to move people to it. In case of WhatsApp and Signal, that incident where that policy change where WhatsApp said it's going to share data to Facebook made a lot of people shift. But I would say it still wasn't enough. Like it was a good incident which created people awareness for people of what Signal was, increased adoption of Signal, but again wasn't enough, right? So it is important whenever a new technology comes, whenever there is a critical incident where society is adopting new forms of technologies, alternates are required early for people to know. If you already have a WhatsApp, it's hard for people to move them to Signal. Similarly, think of like this whole idea of platforms and apps is over. Like I would say the platform revolution is over. Think of the next stage of revolutions that are going to happen in technology. We're talking about drones, we're talking about driverless cars, we're talking about robots. There's a whole of automation revolution that's going to take place, which again, the producers of technology will determine how the technology is being manufactured and who gets to be part of it. Uh, can there be alternate models? If your alternate model exists while this whole revolution is happening, great. But after it becomes a culture, it's really, really hard to change them. So there are these moments where you have to intervene, where these actors who are producing them, like could be a company, could be the government, could be anybody, who are producing certain kind of tools or who are pushing certain kind of cultures uh, into the society, and it could be something that's actually coming out of the society itself. It's not some, or it could be organic, right? It's not something the government's pushing. It's not something capital's pushing, but society is realizing, you know what, climate change is happening, so let's stop doing consumerism. It could be very organic that people suddenly start consuming less, start measuring how much energy that they are consuming, leading to a lot of changes in our society. If you have alternate models then to recommend to people, it could be adopted. But what happens is you have so many of these think tanks that are funded by state, that are funded by private capital, that are funded by a lot of people, which always tell us there are no other alternatives than this. That they with other again it was this. If not other, why don't you recommend us something else? I'm saying, you know what, I don't want an identity. Like we had Vejawada Wilson, who was a petitioner in the Aadhaar case, saying that we don't want the state to identify all of our people as Safai Karmacharis. We don't want it to be in a database. We don't want this identity. Now, if you're asking me to technologically design a new identity system, which includes privacy, I can't, right? Like not having the identity is better than having a certain forms of identity, right? So it's important to intervene during these occasions. It's important to understand why a certain things are happening in our society. And with policing, this new act that's coming into play, it's because of this, and this is what we are going to witness. I believe Maharashtra has recently issued a tender for this 360-degree profiling of policing, which it's copying from Telangana again. And as it happens, if there is anything new, it's going to happen in Hyderabad. It's not that other parts of India won't do it, but you will see it in Hyderabad with a modernization project, and it's important to react to that.
Is there any like online collective who are like actively working in this issue?
So yeah, so sorry, I didn't answer your question on the FOSS alternatives. So I come from a organization which builds some of these free software alternatives. So uh, there's this movement called free and open source software movement, which came as an alternative to an alternative software culture to produce open source software, freedom software. I don't want to call it open source software because there's a difference between FOSS software and open source software. FOSS is freedom and open source software. Open source came out of FOSS, which removed the freedom. The idea of FOSS was to have freedoms in the software making. It's still called free and open source software, but the idea is freedoms. So there are a lot of these FOSS collectives in India and outside India, which who continue to make software for freedoms. Like Signal is one of them, Jitsi is one of these apps, right? So there is Free Software Movement of India where I volunteer. There is FOSS United. I believe there's one more org based out of Bangalore. Uh, there are multiple state FOSS organizations across the country. There is FSF India, Free Software Foundation India. But there are also these open source collectives which are allied with sometimes certain projects. Like we had Mozilla developers, we had Google developers who also promote open source. But mind you, not all of them don't understand politics. Right? Like FOSS is a form of politics in technology when you're talking about freedoms in protection of technology. Uh, some of the devs who are allied to these corporate companies, right? Google developers or even Mozilla, for example, they are FOSS focused, but sometimes they really don't understand the context of politics in those countries and country. Like Mozilla intervened very heavily during Aadhaar, but some of the Mozilla developers did not like what Mozilla was doing with opposing Aadhaar in India. So it's not always uniform. You'll find partners, you'll sometimes find people who oppose some of your own decisions. But yes, there are certain communities. There is also Karana, a group of technologists that kind of was formed during this whole Aadhaar challenge. Uh, they have a website and they hang out on a Telegram group. I can share you the link later. But yes, there are multiple individual technology collectives in the country.
Okay, so we are almost at, it's almost 8:30, and like Prerna, is there any questions that you want to ask
And I
before
just
winding?
want to say one thing. I think when it comes to technology and study of race and caste, right? Like, if you look at who are the people who have been studying surveillance capitalism in the West, it's primarily being African American people who were being affected by new forms of technology discriminating them, right? Like when you talk about criminal profiles in US, criminal profiles on black people always give this scores that tend to be biased, very biased towards them, and which forced a lot of the African American community to understand this, oppose it, and there are so many of these communities in US. And now there is also this whole fight in US in terms of recognizing caste as a form of discrimination in US, right? Uh, which is important because now, like getting this idea of caste being included into Twitter or included in YouTube or any of these big tech policies is also important because how these apps then function, how these systems then function, how they affect certain kind of people is going to be recognized. In that sense, I would say the African American community is an example on what needs to be done in India. So there are also people who are doing critical race studies and caste studies together with technology. There are few the Dalit researchers in India and US who are doing this. You should definitely invite them later. I can pass on a few names. But now it's becoming a study in itself to understand technology and how it affects different social groups.
Thank you, Srinivas. I actually didn't have a question. I was just going to mention about that the emerging area about of caste and critical caste and technology studies. Recently, Oxford University, I think, had a seminar presentation on the same. So I think that's all, and uh, I'd like to give you my thanks, my vote of thanks for taking the time today for making this presentation as a member of APPSC. Thank you for being here. It was a very interesting and a, uh, engaging conversation. I hope we'll get to see you again for another topic, another talk. Thank you.
I really hope to do this physically sometime whenever I'm in Bombay. I will
Yes,
definitely reach out to you guys.
yes,
Yeah, we would really welcome that. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us and like sharing and like creating this awareness of this issue and like how we should be like asserting our rights of privacy as the citizens. Thank you, Srinivas. So let me